Hello and welcome back. That's right, today I want to talk about Gen 5 SSDs and PS5, but more importantly, let's get to the meat and potatoes. What happens when you install a 5th generation SSD inside the PlayStation 5, a 4th generation SSD system? Now, if you've only come to this video to see the test results, there is going to be chapters all the way along the bottom and you can just skip ahead directly to when we slam this Gen 5 SSD inside this PS5 system. But for the rest of you, let's go through a few reasons why this is actually a weird little test, because I am sure there are those of you a little bit versed in the old world of SSDs that read the title for this video and went, oh, waste of time, absolutely waste of time, Gen 4, Gen 5 system, and you're already slamming me in the comments below telling me what a pointless video this is. So before we get to the results, let me explain to you, yes, you Phil, you Malcolm, let me explain why this isn't that stupid a test overall. Now, Gen 4 SSD stands for PCIe Gen 4, the architecture of the CPU and surrounding environment of the PS5, along with PCs of around about the 2020 to 2021 release generation. Now, during that time, we've got two SSDs here. This is the Samsung 980 Pro and this is the Samsung 990 Pro. These two SSDs, released 2 to 2.5 years apart, are two key parts of the Gen 4 SSD generation. Now, why is that important? Because between this SSD being released and this SSD being released, even though they're both Gen 4, the development that's gone into the 4th generation of SSDs has been phenomenal. Not only increasing the performance throughout that time with little tweaks and things throughout the interim, but also improving the controllers and the efficiency and the power use of these SSDs. Now, roll on with Gen 5. Gen 5 has just rolled out pretty much consumer-wise in the last 8 to 12 months, and it's still very early doors. They're really starting to see what they can do with all this extra performance and bandwidth. Does that sound a little bit familiar to something that you've heard of? That's right. The PS4, when it was at the end of its lifespan in terms of development, before a lot of developers started moving towards PS5 as their primary development, some of the games coming out towards the end of the PS4's peak life were phenomenal. The same goes, by the way, for the PS3. Do you remember The Last of Us? And remember The Last of Us Part 2? Both of those games came out towards the end of the PS3 and the PS4's peak development. And that's because they could benefit from, in the past, all of the tweaks and improvements and hotfixes and just efficiency measures to make the most out of this hardware. And exactly the same thing is happening right now with the 5th generation. And the 5th generation of SSDs right now are taking everything they've learnt from Gen 4 and doubled it up with more bandwidth. But there's still going to be people saying, if I put this Gen 5 SSD in here, immediately it's just going to get bottlenecked, isn't it? It's just going to get straight away bottlenecked to Gen 4. These SSDs are still kind of all on the same architecture and backwards compatible. So in theory, because I've not tested it yet, this drive will immediately work inside here. But it's just the PS5 will see it as an older generation SSD. It will still work, but it means it'll only see it as the older generation. So why on earth would you waste money on this? Well, because let's face it, in the future, it's inevitable. The PS5 Pro will be a thing. There will be a PS5 Pro. It will have enhanced hardware inside, and almost certainly, I would say 99.9%, it's going to be a Gen 5 system. So there's going to be users buying big, bold, angry, high-capacity SSDs now, which later on they might migrate into the PS5 Pro. And when that happens, if you buy an old Gen 4 SSD, when you go to the PS5 Pro, and whenever that arrives to 2025-26, when that happens, your SSD is going to be slow because this won't scale upwards. Whereas a Gen 5 SSD will give you peak performance now, and when the PS5 Pro arrives, you can take that SSD out of this, stick it in the Pro, and you can still get that peak performance. So that's one reason why you might slam this inside there. But on top of that, the Gen 5 series of SSDs, one of the main ways in which it benefits is in two main ways. The NAND and the controller. The CPU of the SSD, again, the SSD controller, and the NAND, ultimately where the data lives. And the 5th generation of SSDs, or Gen 5 SSDs even, benefit one from improved controllers that can do a better balancing out between power use and efficiency. Secondly, the NAND is of a higher quality at 232 layer 3D TLC NAND, when Gen 4 peaks out at 176 layer on the most expensive SSDs and goes down in terms of maybe to a 96 layer or 112 layer NAND on Gen 4 SSDs. That means that even though the system will only treat this like a Gen 4 SSD, the components that are inside are optimized anyway, which allows, or hopefully theoretically allows, the system to do a better job of running this as a Gen 4 SSD than it would be with an actual Gen 4 SSD with its lower quality or lower peak performance components inside. Now, one of the things that we've also got to touch on when we look at this in terms of future-proofing is when we put this SSD inside this system, something I'm going to start doing now, it's going to be on the subject of cooling. What is that? Well, we talked about this at length when the PS4 first enabled the use of storage drives as upgrades and the expansion slot of the PS5 via this slot in here. You've seen me do this many times in other videos if you've watched this on the channel. And when we install a drive inside here, one of these M2 SSDs, Gen 4 SSDs get hot. But more importantly, Gen 5 SSDs get even hotter. Now, Gen 5 SSDs like this one, they're not going to be able to fully stretch their muscles in a Gen 4 system, but they're still going to get warm. That's why when you look at the majority of Gen 5 SSDs on the market, ones we've reviewed on the channel or ones coming soon, they either arrive like this one, the next storage from a Sony associated company, and Phison, arriving with an enormous heatsink. And look at the size of this heatsink if I install it inside here. There is no way that lid is going back on there. That heatsink is just too darn big. Now, luckily, in recent months, we have seen SSDs like this one, the ADATA 970 Legend, and SSDs like the Seagate Fuuuu 540 arrive on SSDs that are more compact in their chassis design, but they're still pretty darn tall, like this one here. This Legend, this is the one we're going to be using for today's test, and one of the things you might have noticed at the top is it's got a fan that is powered with an additional power connector that this system does not have. So it's worth bearing in mind if you do end up buying a Gen 5 drive, because again, I've not run these tests, it might be really successful, but if we put this inside this system and it gets really hot, it's not going to have the sufficient cooling that Gen 5 drives are designed to take advantage of. But for now, let's get this drive installed inside here, and we're going to have to maybe take back that cover, get that in there, and we can already see immediately that this drive, even with its lower profile heatsink than the one that we just showed, is still too large to install with this cover. So Sony are probably going to advise you not to go for this solely based on that factor there. So if we get that inside here, we get that installed. Now, as I get this drive installed, it's worth also highlighting the subject of IOPS, because whenever we talk about faster and newer generation SSDs, we more often than not refer to something called sequential performance. This is data that's in a line and it's big, blocky, easy to access data. However, SSDs are also measured, largely more specific SSD circles around the subject of IOPS. IOPS, individual input outputs per second, or I/O. These are when data is randomly pulled from all over the place. It's very small data, typically as the measuring point. And when it comes to open world games or games that are based online, random data access is king. And Gen 4 SSDs, the peak we've ever seen from Gen 4 is around about 1.3 to 1.3.5 million 4K random IOPS. Well, we're seeing in Gen 5 is between 1.5 and 2 million IOPS, which means that even though we're of course going to be utilizing this in a system that's going to limit it to Gen 4 number of bandwidth lanes rather than Gen 5 bandwidth lanes, there's still going to be the optimal performance potential of that NAND, that controller, built into this drive. So it's going to be really interesting to see, one, what the PS5's initial benchmark is going to be, and if we can see any difference in performance between the internal SSD and this Gen 5 SSD. So let's get this system booted up and start our benchmarks. Okay, so I'm going to be straight with you. Initial testing of this has not been good at all. If anything, I would say it is not only a 100% failure, but a 100% failure with about 50% of, oh my god, I think I broke my PS5. But I'm going to demo it for you straight away anyway. Watch this. We've connected our PS5, hopefully on screen. You can also see what I'm seeing here for the HDMI pass-through. The fan is going to be quite close to the mic, so I apologise for how much this mic is going to be picking up the initial fan of the PS5 booting up there. But as you can see here on screen, hopefully flicking over to it, you can see the option there to format the SSD. Now, normally when I format an SSD, indeed, I recently formatted the 990 Pro for a PS5 test this day, like today doing this video. It would normally take something in the region of maybe 10 to 12 seconds maximum. This is what happens when we try to format the Gen 5 SSD inside our system. And in fact, I'm going to put my microphone on something a little higher. There we go. Fingers crossed that deviates some of that vibration. But this is what happens when we format our SSD. It reaches about as high as, I believe it gets to about 12-13%, and it takes a really long time in order to do that. But unfortunately, while this is happening, things seem to stall. Now, right now, the fan on the PS5 is consistent. Can you hear that? If I bring the mic a little closer, and we're getting a stall noise. That's not a good sign at all. We're up to about 6%. Now it goes up to 30. I'm just going to rotate the PlayStation slightly because it's going to be very important that you take note of the blue LED light while this is going on here, because that light is going to basically tell us how the system is dealing with things. Normally you get several colors on the PS5. You get white for initial boot, blue for smooth running, orange or amber for standby mode, and there is occasionally a red LED, which is the worst in the world. But as you can see, our screen has gone black. Our LED is still remained blue, but the system is clearly rebooting. It has given up on that format that we've just tried to do, and now it is restarting the system. But things aren't done yet, because what happens is, I believe it's going to happen somewhere in the region of the next 20 seconds, is the system is going to try and take another run up, and it falters. We hear the fan cool down there, we hear the system start to go into a kind of confused low hum, and we start to see that LED start to thrum there in the background. And unfortunately, this is where the system really got me scared during my provisional testing while getting this part of the table set up. As the light starts to dim in and out, and then immediate blackdown, which is not good. That means the system has now gone into complete power off, and that format wasn't completed. See, I know what you're thinking, well, just tap the power button, right? Well, let's do that then. Let's tap ourselves that power button there, and nothing. See? We didn't hear the thrum, we didn't get the LEDs, we didn't get the boot, we didn't get any spin up at all. I've clicked that power button, and nothing. So at this point, I was thinking, oh well, I've bricked my PS5, oh my god, I'm going to lose my mind. But click it again, and the system went into boot. So at this point, and again, hopefully you'll still see the black screen there, that is the HDMI pass-through that's running into this. The system went into a rebuild state. Anyone that's ever disconnected their USB drive by accident, or you've had a power outage in your area when the system was in standby or mid-game, will know that the system reboot and system repair mode isn't something to be scared of. And as you can see on screen, hopefully, the system repair state has kicked in, and that is the system rebuilding its database very, very quickly before going back into a reboot there, which is what it does, and then it makes its way back into that same PS reboot state when it was asking us if we want to format the drive. Something, again, this is now my third attempt doing this off camera. As you can see the PS logo appearing there on screen, and for me, this is a complete and utter failure for this test. Now, I'm going to go ahead and not format this drive. I'm going to reconnect my PlayStation 5 controller and let the system power down. And again, much like before, when this powers down, ignore that fan kicking there in the background, with that system powering down. It takes significantly longer to power down this time than it normally would. Just another indication that this Gen 5 drive is just not playing ball with this Gen 4 system, despite Gen 5 drives being backwards compatible with Gen 4, Gen 3 systems and prior in terms of SSDs. Now, I could end the video there, couldn't I? I could walk away, brush my hands and go, thank God my PlayStation 5 isn't bricked. But we're not going to stop there, because I think testing one SSD isn't enough. I don't think testing one SSD proves conclusively just what a terrible idea this is. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment, maybe I just like to entertain. But what we're going to do is let this system power down, again taking longer than we're used to, and we're going to install that next storage drive. So this is another Gen 5 drive. Obviously, because of that height, we're not going to be able to keep the cover on this PS5, so we're going to be running it without the cover on, which means that fan is going to be real noisy, so I apologise in advance for that. But when the system powers down, which is just about to do, what I'm going to do is take the side of the casing off, get our new Gen 5 drive for the secondary test in. The system's just on the verge of powering down there, and we're going to go ahead and install our Gen 5 drive, our new Gen 5 drive. So let's go ahead. We've got the system powered down. Pop that there on its side. We can hear the fans have completely ceased, so we're good to go ahead and install our new drive. Again, let's grab our screwdriver. Maybe I'll fast forward this, maybe I won't. I've not decided yet. Okay, so we've got that installed in there. Obviously, we can't apply the secondary half of the enclosure because, as you can see, that SSD is absolutely enormous. So for now, we're just going to pop that there. Hopefully won't let it stagger around too much. Again, I apologise for the noise that's definitely going to come out of that fan. Now, we don't have the chassis and that negative airflow there. But here is our heatsink. There is the LEDs. The SSD's inside there. I don't expect this to run any different than previous testing. But nevertheless, let's give this a punt, shall we? There's our beep. We're going to take a look at the screen while we're doing this. Hopefully we get to the format screen, but chances are we're going to see exactly the same results as what we've previously seen there. I'm going to move that so it's a little bit more visible overall. So again, we've got our drive. We're going to go ahead and format the SSD now. 3, 2, 1, boom. And let's see, we've got to that 6% as well. And it's starting to freeze again. I think we're seeing something of a pattern here, ladies and gentlemen. And ultimately, I think what we're seeing here is, despite all of our reservations about Gen 5 SSDs and the Gen 4 system, thinking, well, there's no point, it can't take advantage of the extra speed. I think the larger and more real problem, unless this proves me otherwise, is that Gen 5 SSDs simply will not function inside this device. The lanes that are afforded to it, I know PS5 released a firmware update very, very recently that allowed it to support up to 8 TB Gen 4 SSDs as 8 TB drives start to roll out from brands like Brent that have had an 8 TB out there in Gen 4 7K performance longer than anyone else. But still nonetheless, we've gone up to 60%. It might not be over yet, ladies and gentlemen. I may have spoke a little bit ahead of myself. Let's see. We're up to 100%. And we have got a absolutely horrendous 4,035 megabytes per second performance threshold. Clearly, this system cannot take advantage of this drive at all, but let's proceed anyway there. So if we go ahead, again, we should run some benchmarks while we can. So what we're going to do is start transferring some games over to this SSD. Not loads, we're just going to test a handful of games and just see if we see any negligible performance on the games on here than we do on the system. Because with a rating of 4,000 megs, if indeed that is true and the benchmark is measuring it as true, that's going to be pretty dire. In fact, while we're talking about it, why don't we do a secondary benchmark just to double check. Let's go back into the storage system there, and as we can see, it can see the Gen 5 Pro drive, it can see it, but it can see the 1 TB of storage that is on there, but we're not really getting much more than that. So if we reformat that drive, that will make the system reboot. When it reboots, it will go back into the format window, and when it does that, we'll be able to do a fresh benchmark on this system to see if it still reports that laughably small 4000 megabytes per second sequential performance. Clearly, the PS5 benchmarking there is not accurate because it's geared towards a Gen 4 drive, and certainly with a newer generation controller inside here, newer generation NAND, and just a general newer architecture than that of the PS5 afforded at the beginning, it's not hugely surprising that things are going somewhat bumpy along the way. But we're back on that format M2. Let's format that drive. Let's see if it goes any quicker or slower than last time as it formats the drive into the PlayStation's own file system. Remember, what we saw before was just I think 4015 megabytes per second. I'm sure you saw it earlier on. And for now, I think that format took, what, a minute and a half from earlier on? I could skip forward, but I don't think I will. I think it's important that we see this unedited so you guys know I'm not kind of shelling BS here. But it's a real shame. I was kind of hoping that this drive, at the very least, would give us comparable performance and comparable numbers to that of Gen 4, because then at least it would justify buying one now if you see one on sale for later down the line for when the PS5 Pro arrives and you'll be able to take advantage of this larger drive in a newer system. Sadly, that doesn't look to be the case here. We're at 60%, so it looks like our format should complete relatively soon. And we can see here again that rather pitiful 4000 megabytes per second there, when the system needs at bare minimum 5500 megabytes per second to match the sequential performance of the internal PS5 SSD. But for now, let's transfer some games over to that SSD. We're not going to go for too many. We're only going to go for a couple of games here because I think what we've seen thus far, more than anything else, states, proves that a Gen 5 SSD and a PS5 is just not an option right now. But I do think we should at least benchmark a couple of games just to know for certain whether that is the case. So let's go ahead and move over Elden Ring and let's pick one other. We'll go for 2 PS5 games here. So we'll go into the storage, go into the console storage, select a couple of games, and I think we'll go with ourselves a little bit of Elden Ring, shall we? So let's go ahead. Let's swaz down to the bottom. Nice and simple, we'll go with Marvel Spider-Man, Miles Morales and Elden Ring. Let's copy those over now. So we should see some early reported transfer numbers here. Bear in mind that when data is being transferred between the internal SSD that the PlayStation arrived with, which is bare NAND on a board, into an external SSD, you are talking about the write performance of the SSD inside. So the write performance I'm seeing here for that 90 gig that we're transferring over is fairly normal. The PlayStation does take advantage of certain compression techniques and encryption techniques of the data when it's being moved around in efforts to prevent piracy. But still, nonetheless, the numbers we're seeing here, when in previous videos we've transferred 200, 300, 400 gig of data, is fairly standard. Unfortunately, we're not able to get a very precise megabytes per second transfer rate, and we're hearing from the system there that SSD is at least doing its job, and it's good to see that it at least went a little bit further than the predecessor. We're not seeing anything here that makes me believe or genuinely feel that the system is able to capitalize on improvement in architecture on that drive, and unfortunately it's looking more and more that this is not only a big old waste of your time, it's a big old waste of my time as well. But let's let it complete and start loading these games up. And again, we should have on screen during that, I won't have access to that, but side by side we will have the PlayStation's own SSD booting the game alongside me booting the game here in front of you. We've got that on screen, so we're just going to come out, but the system does feel just a little laggy. The system does not like that Gen 5 SSD being in there. In the background, you definitely get the feeling the system does not like having to do this. So let's go ahead first with Elden Ring. Let's go into Elden Ring here that we know we've transferred over to that SSD. And what we're going to do is just to do a couple of loading tests there within the game. One, to boot directly into the game, and our secondary test doing a fast travel from within the game there. Again, while I do this, although I can't see it, you will. You'll be able to see the game side by side. So let's go ahead. And we're going to go with continue. So we're going to crack in 3, 2, 1, click. And there for you on screen, it should be side by side. And I've played this game enough to know the feeling. That felt like it was pretty darn quick. That felt pretty comparable to what I'm used to seeing when I'm playing the game. Unfortunately, the monitor that I utilise for this when I'm bench testing is a much lower resolution, and the light isn't very good. So if I get absolutely pwned by some of these enemies around me, that's why. It's not because I'm terrible. I've done really well in this game. But for now, I think that's a reasonable enough test for what we're seeing here before I get absolutely pwned against that. And what we'll do is we'll do a quick fast travel test in just a moment from the fire link there. So let's fire it over. So let's go in and we're going to test loading via a fast travel in 3, 2, 1. That felt pretty much the same. It might have been the tiniest bit laggy, but I didn't really feel like anything there was particularly untoward in terms of the performance numbers that we've seen. Again, all fairly standard stuff. The graphics seem fine, but I'm looking at this via a slightly lower resolution monitor that I'm sure you can see at home right now when they're in the edit. But I think that's good enough for this game, so let's make our way back to the title screen there. Okay, so we're loading into Spider-Man Miles Morales here, and again, fairly straightforward. Just going to go into a straight load from an existing save spot that we've got on the game. We're going to kick in 3, 2, 1. Make our way in, and it should be very, very quick indeed. That felt ever so slightly slower than what we've seen on the internal PS5, but again, I don't have, unfortunately, that original file in front of me like you guys do, but it felt the tiniest bit laggy. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm imagining the whole thing, and this is all just false positives from that PS5, the Gen5 SSD feeling like it was about to break my console. But for now, I'd say we can end things there, at least in terms of the testing, because even if it's comparable, I still wouldn't happily recommend using a Gen5 SSD on a PS5 system right now. So if we come out of the game here, what we're going to do is just transfer those games back, and we'll start talking about, not the game content, we'll start talking about and kind of summarising everything we've learned today, because frankly, I think we've learned one major thing from today's video. Let's move that, 3, 2, 1. If there's one thing we've learnt during the course of today's testing, it is that using Gen5 SSDs inside the PS5 system is by no means recommended. Notwithstanding that we got 50% of our test ratio here feeling like we'd bricked our system, right now this secondary SSD that I've got running inside this system doesn't feel flush. It doesn't feel very smooth. The gameplay seemed pretty fine. The benchmarks of the initial system were all out of whack. And if the PS5's own internal benchmarking system is not giving us reliable data, that can only make us question any other performance numbers from this SSD in this system. Ultimately, I would have liked to have seen that Gen5 SSD at the very least performing exactly the same as any other Gen 4 SSD right now, because it would have justified the means to buy one of these drives and then later down the line when PS5 Pro arrives to take that drive over to the new system, maximising the long-term investment in your storage. Unfortunately, sadly, what we've seen here is that Gen5 SSD, if anything, has thrown us too many hurdles and too many question marks about its viability as a choice for your storage, and therefore I cannot at all recommend the use of Gen5 SSDs in a PS5 system for a multitude of reasons, not just the ones you guys are spamming me about in the comments. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more about this or more tests with Gen5 SSDs, maybe this is something we'll return to in a year from now, where a firmware update may make things better, just like it did with those ATBs. We'll find out. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed it, like, subscribe, usual stuff. And there's links and guides in the description to other recommended SSDs for PS5, PS5 guides. Again, everything from the kits that I've built around this with that PS5 covering there with using the PS2 style, and other recommended guides and drives to buy in the description. Apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.